Moreover, a considerable portion of gun deaths can be attributed to suicides, not mindless attacks by right-wing extremists like Christians who attend school board meetings. Thus, these self-inflicted shootings are not a public safety problem to justify the erosion of the constitutional right of the people to keep and bear arms. Okay, so what? For quite some time now, we have experienced a spree of mass shootings as reported by the left-wing media. What if, as implied above, deranged people are seduced into such actions by left-wing operatives, so the mass shooting violence is reported and reported and reported by the media, so people will come closer to agreeing that guns are bad and must be taken away from law-abiding citizens, so we the people can live in Democrat-provided safety. Or should we say utopia? That may sound like tinfoil hat theorizing, but it's worth mentioning as food for thought anyway. Who else is more devoted to, benefits from, or has a vested interest in disarming us? And who else is less absent of a moral barometer than secular socialists? If among the core value of socialists is atheism, one has to wonder who benefits from that, too. Let's workshop that question. People wanting to get rid of God, wanting to abolish religion, and all things religious sounds a lot like Satan is the sole beneficiary. And as we know, he is a grand master at manipulating and deceiving people, which the left does with greater regularity than a prune-eating person binging on laxatives. So as not to confuse, let's differentiate. Socialism was Marx's economic system, and communism was his endgame and his goal. In other words, two sides of the same coin with one leaning on the other. The true Marxist believes that socialism was the final step that leads to a utopia they called communism, and nobody is ever going to truly achieve it. Communism to Americans is what we always thought the Soviet Union was all about. We thought it to be a tyrannical police state where there were no freedoms. But that was peculiar to the hyper-desire to control people as demanded by socialism alone. The ultimate goal was communism, also what the Soviet-era Russians believed to be utopia. According to the Soviet Russians, communism was the state at which they achieved Marx's definition of a perfect society in which everybody was happily equal, albeit in happily controlled. So somebody who grew up in the Soviet era and ceasing propaganda convinced most of them that communism was a goal they wanted to achieve where everybody is equal. Nobody but the government will own anything. And their definition of a true communist state is a perfect society where everything is provided to each person according to their needs, and from each person is given according to their abilities. But if their needs and abilities are not the same, it seems communism is an unreachable goal and a veritable oxymoron. And Soviet Russian ever actually got that far despite living under the socialist system for about 7 decades. Thus, utopia is apparently only the Marxist's hot, sweaty dream, not a potential reality. Let's recap. God and Satan are at war. That much we've said. These two have been at odds with each other for a very long time. God has created heaven where things are perfect. Everybody is equal. Love is palpable, and it is a stunningly beautiful place where all God's children should want to spend eternity. However, Satan, a former angel, wanted to be God once upon a time, and along with the angels who sided with him was cast out of heaven because he thought he should be God, and got a little too full of himself. Now, to the extent God lets him, Satan rules on earth and gives us a hard time. Marxist socialists are atheists. So what better plan for Satan's revenge than to boot God out of society by installing godless socialism as far and wide as possible on earth, thus leaving fewer souls to worship and glorify God? Hence, Satan set out in the Garden of Eden to corrupt as many as possible among God's most cherished creations, mankind. He knows the Bible inside out, upside down and sideways. So he knows God's laws, and the more he can seduce people to break them, the more souls he can keep out of heaven. And there is only one other destination. That would be his own address, i.e., hell. There is also a disturbingly popular point of view that is now being perpetuated by people calling themselves evolutionary biologists and members of the list shown early on in this presentation who believe that life on Earth began with a big bang and a shaky, unproven, illogical, fanciful, and unsupportable process that turned disassociated strands of DNA into primitive creatures, which magically assembled themselves into higher orders in the oceans, and then crawled out onto the shore where they supposedly evolved into mankind. In point of fact, an animated version of this story has been shown on a continuous loop video in one of the museums of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. I was there. I saw it, and while it was nice animation, it was an unrealistic fantasy story. As a biologist, I can say without equivocation that evolution has never been held as anything more than a theory. And B, it is scientifically and statistically impossible. Along with the godless socialists we've talked about are there useful idiots who dwell in that above-mentioned list and who try feverishly to convince the rest of us that there is no God. One of the more subtle efforts is shown in the use of BCE to establish a time frame. BCE means before the Common Era. So, what made the era common? We used to say BC to refer to a point in time which meant before Christ, trying to eradicate God and make non-Christians happier. We're now avoiding acknowledging the age-old practice of comparing a time reference in relation to Jesus. The left is still trying to secularize everything and routinely trying to kick God out of the public forum by claiming there are constitutional prohibitions that separate church and state. But that doesn't really exist in the Constitution. It never did. Come to think of it, who was it that said, "If you tell a big enough lie and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it"? The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of a lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent. For the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state.